Yeah, that's good. So, yeah, I personally think the devil has plenty of advocates and has done for hundreds of years, but Duncan certainly did a good job of being that. I thought this was going to be Occupy Where Next, but it seems more of a sort of excavation of what the movement is per se. I will say a few words at the end about where I think we need to go. It's very important not to confuse directly attributable consequences of things with the idea of what we might have achieved in all sorts of ways that are very difficult to quantify. One of the main ways that Occupy was successful over the sort of 3 or 4 months that it was heavily in the media was that in the right-wing press, which slagged it off as much as it possibly could, roughly along the lines that Duncan expressed. I actually lived in the camp as far as I'm concerned. Duncan didn't, as far as I know. Maybe did. I think there was not a single bit of meaningful violence between anyone in the camp, or I mean, there was some people with real problems who came because we provided a warm, welcoming space, and I think for Occupy to have been so vilified for that, and again on this stage, I think it is not appropriate or helpful. The reality is there wasn't a single issue of violence from any member of the camp to anybody outside the camp. I think people who've lived on the street, I think often maybe do express themselves in quite extreme terms, but the vast majority of sort of difficult verbal encounters didn't turn into anything physical. And I think it's very important to distinguish between the right-wing media narrative, which Duncan seemed to represent, and what it was actually like most of the time. And I think Melanie hopefully did represent that. What do we mean by we are the 99%? For a start, that must include everyone in this room. I think one of the things I've been struggling with over this weekend is that we've talked in various talks about the need not to have silver bullets when it comes to engaging with the environmental situation. But I think what we tend to do without realising it is engage with our own group, whether it's the Green Party or Occupy or anything else, as the silver bullet. And what that means is that we tend to develop a narrative that says, you know, programmatic politics is the way, and then other people say direct action is the way. The reality is, of course, these things have to work together, and we have to really work out how to coordinate the many currently divided and ruled elements of civil society that do basically agree, if we're to have any chance of challenging the incredibly concentrated political and economic power that there is. Certainly relative to the ideal that we might have liked to imagine that Occupy would be, namely, you know, 1,000 to 10,000, let's say, people who'd already established exactly where they came from and had built the connections both personally and politically, etc., that would have been required to go into that space and immediately start announcing nuanced, well-conceived, sort of programmatic political policies. That would have been great, but that's not what the movement was. It was about creating a democratic space, as Melanie said, for loads of very, very different people to come together. And it's very important also to bear in mind this is a global movement. It's been very specific in the UK, partly because of the predominance of the city, both in terms of UK politics and in terms of the city's influence on the rest of the world. So a lot of the focus in Occupy was on London, despite the fact there were many camps around the country. But Occupy in America, for instance, is still very, very much active. And I think partly because the police arrested 800 people on Brooklyn Bridge, which really sort of ignited a lot of anger in people, because as I think was the case for hundreds of years of the British Empire, the City of London and the British authorities generally are very kind of polite in their repression. Repressive tolerance is an interesting phrase that I heard recently to describe the attitude of authorities to protest and attempts to change things. But because of that, it was very difficult to motivate an incredibly depoliticised nation. You know, the reality is because we've been the most neoliberalised for 30 years, we have become the most depoliticised. And the reason we weren't trying to kind of decide everything straight away was because what we wanted to do was open the space to include more and more people. And it's certainly the case that if let's say, 10% of the people who actually agreed with what Occupy was doing and immediately saw it as something really positive had actually tried to come to those spaces on a regular basis, that would have vastly diluted the influence of people who came to the camps with very real problems. In terms of where we're going next, it has to be about how we're going to get each other out of our we-goes. And ego is a very interesting term I came across a couple of years ago. An ego is to an individual as a we-go is to a group. And the same kind of rules tend to apply, that we tend to develop a sort of in-group, out-group mentality. We tend to have a very different attitude to the people inside the group that we identify with, to the people outside the group. And obviously when you're trying to be the 99%, that's something that we really have to work through. So in a sense, I'm more interested in this session on all of us talking about where we, the 99%, think Occupy should go next, and how we relate to things like the Green Party, how the Green Party avoids the tendency, given its need to try and be sort of accessible and on-message, how it avoids the tendency to be sort of sucked into that to the point where it's not really engaging with the incredible urgency of both the economic crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, the ecological crises, plural. I personally think that the Green New Deal, with all sorts of caveats in terms of how it needs to be different from the New Deal after the Second World War, in terms of doing things as far as possible at a local level and empowering people in communities, and Melanie's Occupy Law movement that's focusing on the Community Bill of Rights is helping us move in that direction. I think that there are obviously changes to the New Deal approach that the Green New Deal implies, not least because we have to retool the entire economy, rethink the way we do virtually everything. But I think that is a really inspiring message that both the Green Party and Occupy can get on board with. And as the economic crisis gets worse and worse, there is no doubt that there will be more and more people finding that the sort of ship that they've been slightly anxiously but mostly comfortably holding on to is actually rocking more and more, and they will be interested in coming out. The challenge for Occupy and the Green Party is how to be really inclusive without losing a sense of the incredible urgency of where we're at, and being strategic, engaging with the problem of information politics. Politics, direct action politics and change is not so much about what our words mean in local environments, it's about how they get manipulated by $2,000 billion worth of public relations and advertising dollars across the world. How do we make a message, how do we embody a message that is inspiring, that shows people that another world is possible? And that one idea, well, it might sound like a cliche. I think if we could restore truth to cliche, by the way, we'd have the world that we need already. But amazing things have happened in South America over the last 15 years. Do people know about the ALBA countries? 12 countries in the South American Caribbean region, Bolivia, Ecuador, etc., that have really worked together to buy themselves out of the sort of Washington yoke, and they've done so very successfully. And the two ideas that have motivated that movement are Un Otro Mundo es Posible, so another world is possible, and the other one is Un Pueblo Unido jamás será vencido, so a people united will never be defeated. And that's what we have to work against. Divide and rule has destroyed the world more and more and divided people more and more for hundreds of years, and our real challenge is how to bring about the kind of grounded, sensible, compassionate revolution, which would mean that the values that 99% of us already claim to hold would be expressed in the world around us. Thanks very much.